Welcome back to the Horizons Review. I'm here again with Cody, and today we're going to discuss the topic of manners. So, generally, my hope was in these episodes we would anchor each discussion with some sort of book or essay, but I've been moving, I've had a lot going on, and I brought this up to Cody a couple weeks ago as a topic that I had been thinking about. Um, Hopefully, that this podcast doesn't become in the future just things I'm thinking about, or we'll end up like doing things like talking about the McDonald's diet. Or things like that. Um, but yeah, this is a topic that I think is interesting. It's something that I think sometimes needs to be defended or defined a little bit more properly. So, what I mean when we're going to discuss manners today is I do want to draw like some boundaries around the discussion. And I don't think that this is like the actual boundary of what manners means versus etiquette. It's just what I want to talk about in this podcast. Is by manners, I'm talking about speech, body language, sort of the positioning that you take in social interactions with another person. And I'm not talking about, let's call these other things etiquette, even though these aren't strictly divided from each other in the way that we normally talk about them. I'm not talking about things like table manners. I'm not talking about like whether or not how you should respond to a wedding invitation or something like that. Like I'm talking about what I would say is like the normal everyday interactions that you have with both strangers and intimates and the sort of behavior that you engage in there, both in speech and body language. Um, so one thing is that when manners are critiqued, I think there's a few different ways that manners get critiqued. And the first one I wanted to talk about is the way in which people critique manners as a sort of social artificiality. And I think what's often going on here is I think that sometimes people confuse manners with a different type of relationship. And there's no good word for this relationship, so I've kind of taken to calling it obeisance. So I think manners is always a reciprocal relationship. It doesn't have to be a um, completely mirrored reciprocal relationship. Like you can have slightly different responsibilities to the person that you're engaging with, and their responsibilities to you, but there does have to be like some sort of reciprocal responsibilities. The counterexample to this is like imagine a society where like you're a peasant and there's like some noble class that you have to refer to in a particular way, and they have absolutely no reciprocal obligations to how they treat you. And that would be a relationship of obeisance. And I think a lot of people fear that any sort of mannered relationship puts them in that sort of obeisance position towards the person that they're being mannered towards. And I think that accounts for some of the artificiality concerns. And then the other thing that I think sometimes happens is people think that any sort of prescribed social role is inherently restrictive. And you see a lot of this come out in critiques, especially around feminist philosophy. Um, but that's sort of where I wanted to start, was with that first critique. And I wondered what you had, if you had anything to add about that, Cody, since I've been talking for a few minutes now.
Yeah, I wonder about this. I find this point about obeisance very interesting, where the manners themselves are not mirrored in a reciprocal way. But I also wonder to what extent that, say, um, manners are in some way controlled, right, such that you can understand what kind of dyadic relationship you're taking on during social interaction. And I think that not just like obeisance, but also something like grace would play in here, wherein if you recognize, for example, that you're around someone who doesn't really respect the manners or knows them right, this would be more like the counterexample of not the peasants, being respectful towards the nobles, but the other way around. That if there's that I'm a mannered person and I realize I'm talking to an unmannered person, one or to what extent that's not really obeisance, but maybe that's grace.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's also like the people sometimes worry about like, oh, is this actually like if I use manners and someone else isn't using them, am I just condescending to
Yeah.
them
No,
or
precisely.
things? Yeah. Um, I think another false view that sometimes gets connected to this is that people think that manners are primarily for the other person
Yeah.
that in the interaction. And I think in a lot of ways, actually, the primary function is for your own benefit. And I think that that will come out more as we keep going. Um, but I think it's like so manners serve like they create a social role for the participants,
Hmm.
and that social role actually protects you from the other person because it doesn't really like let's say for example like let's pretend manners are a game
Hmm.
and you're both playing the mannered game. So you're a retail worker and you're, calling the customer sir, ma'am, you're, using all the right words. You're working at Chick-fil-A, so you're saying my pleasure. And the person starts being rude to you. Well, in some sense, like they're actually not being rude to you anymore. Like as long as you keep playing that role, like
Hmm.
it's not really about you.
Right.
It's about this other thing. And like some people, oh, but isn't that actually artificiality if you're playing a role? And I don't think it is. I think there's like some subtle things going on there, but it does protect you from any sort of interaction devolving into this thing that like wounds your personal honor
Yeah.
and sort of demands some sort of response as long as you stay in that mode.
I'd heard this a similar argument with regards to just the change in dining norms in the United States over the past 30 years. There was a point when you had your waiters and your waitresses. They didn't really, ask you how your day was or
Yeah.
try and have small talk or anything with you. But they had kind of a strict social role, which I think, like you're saying, both protected them and protected the diner from any kinds of inappropriate intrusions into their personal lives. Right? You go to something like, and this might go back to your point about, to the extent that manners are artificial. I mean, you go to something like TGI Fridays, something like that, where the role of the waiter is to be very aggressive into your personal life.
Yeah.
And they will at times, cross boundaries. I find that even more uncomfortable than having the social role in place. Um,
Or the I don't know if this is actually true. People always allege that Trader Joe's employees are
oh yeah,
encouraged to flirt with you. Like I don't know if
it
that's
feels
actually a
like
true
it.
thing or not,
Definitely
but
feels like it.
that seems to me to be so much more awkward than normal customer service. But so like I am saying that there is this inauthentic element to some degree to manners, but I think it's bad to sort of give in to like I think there's a lot of neurosis if you feel like oh you're not being yourself or it's somehow wrong. Like it's
Hmm.
inauthentic in a morally negative way to engage in the manners game.
Right.
And not only that, I'll be a little bit stronger than that, but like another critique is people sometimes feel though manners people read too much about morality
Hmm.
into manners. And I think that there are societies that have done that. There are culture, there are places and times in which people have equated manners and morality too closely.
Sure.
But I also think that manners are an important moral and ethical signal, and that manners are an ethical obligation that are put on us. So I'm gonna be pretty strong about putting my cards on the table there. But manners are also culturally relative, even if the ethical obligation is not culturally relative. So if I moved to Japan and was speaking Japanese fluently and I continued to only use American manners, I would be failing in my ethical obligation, even though engaging in the same behavior at home would not be wrong.
Right.
And I mean, like, your responsibility changes with what you know, and numerous other things. And this does get to the idea. It's like, okay, so what are the failure cases for manners? Like, when are manners malfunctioning? And this is another way that people sometimes critique it, is they associate manners themselves with the situations where they malfunction. And that's when I think like a big failure case for manners is the case where the rules are either arcane
Hmm.
or they're constantly changing.
Yeah.
And in either of those cases, doing what's the well mannered thing is much more reflective of either your leisure to keep up with the arcane and changing rules, or your education, because it's difficult enough to know
Yeah.
um, what's mannered. Um, and I think this comes up kind of, and I think this is going to come up in a few different ways throughout this discussion, anyhow. Um, but this often comes up in debates about speech.
Hmm.
Is that people are like, when people want to enforce certain speech codes, I mean, usually the argument is even simpler than that. They'll just say, "Oh, you're just being a decent person." But sometimes they'll say, "Oh, it's just manners
Yeah.
to engage in this particular behavior." But that might be true. That is the manners of the college campus or
Yeah, I
whatever.
was
But
thinking in particular the
expecting that of
pronoun thing.
expecting that of everyone, like people who haven't got the update to act that way, and then to morally judge them for not engaging in that, like that is a failure mode of manners.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing that people sometimes do to attack manners, which I think is true, but is actually a good thing about manners, is people say manners are just a cloak
Mhm.
for potentially hostile
Yeah.
interactions. But I think that's
That's
like
a
one
good
of the
thing.
reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're great. Is it's a much better world in which people are taking on these roles and like not engaging in hostility than a world where people are constantly rubbing up against each other and actually engaging in conflict.
I think about it from like a game theoretic perspective, right? Like everyone kind of at least knows what the norms are and what the score is. You know exactly when a violation has taken place. That said, if the rules of the game are changing too fast and there's any amount of noise in the system, right, you get all kinds of violations of these manners.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of relevant to this college campus thing. And so I think one thing that manners maybe do is not only provide you, hedging against conflict, but they at least I think allow you to know the score of the situation that you're in by providing you with those social roles.
Yeah, the other thing is about manners providing social rules is they prevent every social situation from potentially becoming like a philosophical battleground. And
Mm-hmm.
this is a point I actually got from a very old, I think it came out when I was in college, Theodore Dalrymple column, where he was saying, "Oh, well, if it weren't for manners, any everyday interaction has this potential to just devolve into an argument about philosophical first principles,
Right.
and you can't get anywhere." And I think that's true. I think if you don't have a functional system of manners, like you are in this bizarre world where you have to just engage in arguing about ethics with every single person you come across potentially.
Right. Yeah. You have to kind of construct the stage anew. Which I think I wonder to what extent this is part of a lot of people's modern confusion with others is because of a possible decline of I think social norms that we all know about or manners that we all have to kind of obey or keep together, right? With that decline, everything just turns into confusion in some way. And paranoia, say for example, about the other sex, is something that's extremely common now. Um, but also, I think in everyday conversations.
Yeah, bringing up the other sex is actually something that I was thinking about today when I was thinking about the reciprocity
Mm-hmm.
argument. like one very strong argument for why perfect reciprocity is not necessary or maybe not even particularly desirable for manners is this idea that, like, okay, if there was perfect reciprocity between men and women in manners, like that doesn't necessarily make sense. Like a situation where men have a there's a much higher burden for men to act mannered towards women makes perfect sense from this aspect of like any given man is potentially a dangerous threat to a
Right.
woman,
Right.
and disarming that perception by showing that you know what the rules of the game are is in fact very important.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. Um, and I think it kind of, at least if you think about like a dating market or something, I think it levels out. I don't want to make this sound scuzzy, but it levels out the playing field in some way such that everyone is playing the same game and you don't have these free riders, um, these kind of lone aggressive males that can, take over these situations.
Yeah. So the other critique of manners, which I think is a much harder case, and I will revisit this at the end. I think once we've built up a bit more of this argument and where it's going, is the potential tension between manners as an ethical obligation and
Mm,
um, parrhesia, like the idea that you should be frank and you have obligations to the truth.
sure.
And we can think of plenty of ways in which these two rub up against each other.
Yeah.
Like there's a moral belief that you believe is deeply wrong, but there's a mannered obligation not to cause needless conflict with
Yeah.
someone. And if it comes up in a social situation that someone holds this moral belief, a lot of people will say, oh, well, you have this obligation to confront it. And I think, no, this is actually a very subtle question of like when you confront things and when you don't. And there's an obvious place where there's a public square where you have the duty of parrhesia about
Yeah.
these moral
Yeah.
questions. And then there's spheres where it becomes more and more private and
Hmm.
the duty is more on the side of like manners and avoiding conflict. And but I think most people are strongly they have like I think most people their intuition is they want strong moral rules. They want, oh, I always have to speak the truth,
Yeah.
or I always have to do the polite thing. And this comes up all the time in debates about free speech, for example, is that people say, well, you shouldn't say this, and they mean you shouldn't say this in the mannered context. So therefore you can't say it anywhere. And vice versa. There are people who are like these free speech absolutists who you get the impression that they really do just want a license to be rude at all times.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting that oftentimes this frankness is seen as it's seen almost as like a moral counter signal to manners, right? It's an inversion of the manners game and saying, well, I'm actually going to play a different one. Um, and I think there's a duty to. You see this all the time in academia, right? You see these like messy slobs who are very abrasive, uh, during conferences and stuff, and just kind of gross people. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, well, we're in a profession where you always have to speak truthful things and identify falsities in the world. Therefore, I'm just going to play into this social role where effectively I'm just going to do whatever I want, and I think that it's benefiting the discourse. Um, I don't know. It's hard to say to what extent these people are healthy for these kinds of systems. Maybe you want one or two of them, but you certainly don't want this thing to be turned into a norm with others, particularly like you were saying in private interactions, right? Where what you end up doing is through your abrasiveness, you actually guide someone away from uh, maybe belief of the truth. Um,
Yeah, like knowing who you can confront, knowing the level at which you can confront them, like all these things are really subtle. And it's why I think like I do think this is a hard case. Like if you wanted to make a case against manners, I think the idea that like manners rub up against
Hmm.
your duty to be truthful is the best argument that you can make against them. But
Yeah.
I think in order to explore, I think why manners are still a good moral signal and an ethical obligation um, that can compete with this, we have to build, I think, more of the case for manners. So I say table that critique uh, for now, but I do think it is an important critique
I would
of
associate it
manners as
with
a technology.
discussions in politics about the role of civility, right? I think this is
Yeah,
precisely the same thing, and it is kind of a hard question. Like, what are you losing with your civility by not just playing the real politique and trying to get the thing that
right.
you think is true done? Um, and I think what you end up losing is, again, like you were saying, that reciprocal relationship that I think that manners can cultivate. Uh, in some way,
Yeah,
maybe Parisia takes on some level of selfishness. Uh, it's a
but it is
personal
also
goal. Yeah,
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 it is also just like a different game, and there are lots of different modes that you can interact
yeah.
with people, and like actually one of the important things about manners is if they didn't exist, you wouldn't have this like initial social set such that you have when you drop it, you can signal intimacy.
Hmm.
Like if it allows you to actually, show layers, like you can build up some trust with someone, then you sort of drop that game, go and you go into another social mode, and then you signal to that person effectively, oh, I think of you as like entering into like a more intimate
Right,
sphere with
right.
me.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about things like friendship. Right, there's certain things that if you disapprove of your friend's behavior or habits, it's actually very hard to tell them until you get to a level of closeness with them. Right.
Yeah,
You have to cultivate that before it's like, okay, like, I've played the mannered game long enough. Now what I'm doing is like not to harm you, and it's not a selfish goal on my end.
yeah,
But it's actually might actually be part of the mannered system
yeah.
that I'm telling you this.
And that's also like one of the clear failure cases for a friendship as
Hmm.
well, is if you have a friendship where you can critique the other person and then for whatever reason they become pricklier over time, or like they find themselves in a mode where they begin to like no think that they are now above criticism,
Yeah.
and then that's a very clear signal that this friendship is breaking down, is like
Mm,
when you can't engage in that sort of critique, when you have to go back into a more mannered mode with this
right.
person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. It's like an inversion of the experience of friendship, right? Where uh, you jump into these depths, and then people say, "Oh, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells around you," right?
yeah,
And then you
is
revert back
yeah,
into.
yeah, you realize it's breaking down once you have to, and that happens all the time. Like everyone has this experience of there are people that they used to be very close with, and now you sort of engage in these sort of like more mannered interactions on Facebook or whatever, where you're just like, oh yeah, congratulations on the promotion, and that's sort of the maybe you get dinner with them once every few years, and that's kind
Yeah,
of the extent of the relationship at this point.
yeah, right.
um,
I mean, I don't want to keep pushing the question about this speaking frankly thing, but I do think that this reciprocal relationship in manners is very important, and this relationship between Parisia and selfishness, like one seeing. I think if you view manners as this dyadic thing, right? What you have then is a personal ethic that is in some extent altruistic. It's not completely altruistic, like you still get payoffs in the sense that I'm protecting myself by utilizing this social norm. I know that when you get mad at me over the social norm, you're not mad at me. Uh, but on the other hand, that that personal ethic that you have with speaking frankly is really not. It doesn't necessarily seem altruistic unless you view precisely uh, truth as like some kind of common good, which I think many people do, and that's fine. But I think that's a very different thing from viewing your relationships as the common good, right?
Yeah. So we sort of already got into this part of the discussion, but I kind of want to just sum it up before we move on. Is like, so what do manners do? And so we sort of discussed like they serve as a way to prevent conflict. I think they serve as a way to create shared space for interaction. And I would say like they're sort of like a they're like table stakes for showing that you're invested in civilization. It's kind
Mm,
of like,
yeah, right, right.
you've showed up and you've said like I'm going to do the minimum that signals to you that I respect the rules of our culture and the game, and I am not going like it's very unlikely if I am behaving towards you in a mannered open fashion that I'm going to suddenly become violent or aggressive towards you. um it really does send like this minimally like it seems like in our culture it is a very minimal thing to do, but it sends such a valuable signal that it does open doors for you. People often say like, this is really funny. So in my 20s, I used to get pulled over a lot because I didn't respect the game of not speeding, and I very rarely got tickets.
Mhm.
And people often say, "Oh, like women never get tickets because like they won't give tickets to someone who's hot or something like that." And I really don't think that's it. I think it's women are just more polite to cops when they're pulled over.
Right.
And like generally speaking, I was just very, very polite to the police when they pulled me over. And usually that we would just end up having a conversation and they go, "All right, I'm going to let you go this time."
Be
And I would
careful.
just go on my way. Like it is like, you can get out of a lot in your life by just showing that you're going to be a reasonable
Yes,
person,
right,
even if
right.
you are doing this habitually unreasonable thing like I was, like regularly driving 20 miles above the speed limit.
Yeah, yeah. You played the interpersonal game with them, but
Yeah.
I think you failed society, Kyle. And
Yeah, I was free riding uh, by pretending to be civilized when I actually was not. But I actually like, speaking of my 20s though, this is a situation where I thought about this a lot because a lot of my 20s was spent working in horrible retail environment
Gotcha.
where I was a pharmacy technician, and it's one of the worst customer facing positions you can possibly have
Yeah, because
because
people are getting
usually when people are
screwed.
at
Yeah, they're
yeah
sick.
because usually when people are at the pharmacy, they're sick, their child or their spouse or someone is sick. It's at the end of a long, stressful day. They've been utterly bewildered by the way the medical system works
Yeah,
for at least 4 hours by the time that they see you. And generally, like something else confusing or horrible is happening to them
yeah.
when they come to the pharmacy. And you are the lowest status person that they've dealt with all
All
day.
day, right?
And you're at the end of it. So you're going to get the brunt of it.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, it's like I realized is like just being exceedingly polite, like didn't just diffuse the other person sometimes, because a lot of times it didn't, but it just made the whole thing not matter to me. Like it never
Mm,
sort of like reached down to my core because I never felt like I was getting in conflict
yeah,
with those people. And that was like that was the experience that made me realize that that manners protect the person who's
yeah.
offering the manners.
Right, right.
It's because if I hadn't been in that mode, like, because I saw coworkers of mine who couldn't keep up the game in the face of the pressure, and they would tend to melt down. Like, people would get so upset they would cry, or they'd start yelling back at people. Like, lots of tense emotions happening at the pharmacy.
Yeah, yeah.
um,
It's like St. Paul says, be not at fault. Make sure
yeah.
that you're not doing the things that others aggress you for.
So the next thing, like, and this is the next um, maybe stranger um, point that I want to make is, so like Iris Murdoch has this thing where she talks about love being attention,
Yeah,
and
I'm
not just
really
that,
excited
it's
to
like
talk about this.
disciplined, sustained attention
Mhm.
that overcomes your ego, trains it towards another. Um, and I think manners are kind of a microcosm of this. If you're properly engaging in the manners game, I think part of it actually is being it's not it's not just what you say, it's not just your body language, it's also being very, very open to the experience of the other person and paying close attention to what they're saying, how they are acting, what they're telling you, what their comportment is towards you, all these other things. And if you're properly engaging in the manners game, you do, like, once again, it's like not romantic love, it's not intense,
Yeah,
but like there is a sort of selflessness where you have an openness to the other person that if you're properly engaging in manners, like you actually create. And yeah, that's to the benefit of the other person, but I also think it's just to your benefit that you
right.
have like this more loving, open disposition towards people that you're having to interact with.
I think about this in relation to, this idea that manners are aristocratic or bourgeoisie. At least in my life, the most polite and I feel like attentive people I've ever met have been aristocrats. Or one time I met Robert Gates, and it was clear that this was like, this polite guy from Kansas who was really, you know, is it the case that he was going to actually do, what I was talking to him about? I don't know, but I definitely felt like he was considering it during the course of our conversation. And likewise with some of the other aristocrats who carry that norm with them, who tend to not really in a facetious way, like ingratiate themselves with you, um, regardless of who you are. They have that game kind of built in as a heuristic. Um,
Yeah. And this is where like manners are like, this is another thing I've thought in the past too, is like manners are also like they they're kind of a training in learning how to charm people. Because if you properly learn the manners game and open yourself up to the other person, that is kind of the essence of being charismatic.
yeah,
Is that
right.
the people in one-on-one interactions or in small group interactions is making the person that you're interacting with feel like you're actually paying
They're
total
being
attention
attended
to.
to. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Like that is what makes someone individually magnetic, is that ability to communicate attention. And like once again, you can be false. Like you can communicate attention without actually intending
right.
to provide anything by it. So none of these signals are perfect, but if you're genuinely paying attention to people, like you deserve the benefits that you get from being charismatic.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it has a personal payoff, right, of charisma, but again, it has this altruistic payoff of,
Right.
since we are playing the game, um, I'm not going to, shuck you or
Right.
simply throw you away because I find you lower value or something, right? So long as manners are, you know, Catholic in some sense.
So this is what I mean. I think this is the essence of manners, is manners as a technology are a
Mm,
way to increase the amount of attention that actors are paying towards each other, and you do it by creating sort of these basic social rules that help signal attention, help attune you towards attention. Um, it's a lot like um, the funny analogy that I think of is where people talk about, oh, during the work from home era, there were people who had this realization, like this isn't true for everyone, but a lot of people had this realization in the work from home era that they actually still had to get dressed for work.
Yeah.
If they didn't get dressed for work, if they tried to just work from home in their pajamas or whatever, they found themselves like they were slacking, they weren't really doing what they needed to be doing, they were having a hard time. These like little outward, like seemingly quote unquote meaningless formal signals like actually do train you to operate in the proper mode.
Yeah.
And manners are one of those things. It's like, yeah, the rules, any given system of manners, some of the rules might be arbitrary, but participating in those arbitrary rules reminds you of what you're supposed to be doing. And that thing that
Hmm.
you're supposed to be doing is like paying genuine attention to the other person that you're interacting with.
Right. Yeah. It brings you back into that attention space.
Yeah. And this is why I think manners are a valuable social signal. Is not just that they show that you've like learned the basic cultural rules, but because those cultural rules um, put you in this mode where you're able to pay close, where you're almost forced to pay closer attention to the other person.
Hmm.
Um, that I think the signal is highly valuable, and that's also why I think there's an ethical obligation in the situations where manners are called for
Hmm.
to engage in the mannered mode. So it's not like any given system of manners like
I see. Right.
proceeds forth from the form of the good
Yeah. 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 Right. Right.
unimpeded or anything like that, but it's is any functional system of manners is trying to achieve something that in itself is good.
Yeah. And this is, in a sense, why manners across societies can be arbitrary.
Yeah.
Uh, that they can latch on to whatever needs to be attended to in their different ways and ensure that, yeah, I'm someone who not only follows the rules, but respects others around me. And
Right, but
I
it's
think,
it's
yeah, yeah, and then a personal ethic guides you to doing the right thing.
yeah, but it's also like the formal dress thing, right? What formal dress is going to vary
Yeah, yeah,
wildly across societies, but
but there is one.
what it hopefully accomplishes is something similar, which is, oh, I now that I've put on this particular clothing, I now am playing this particular role
Right.
at this moment.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing that's very similar um, is um, modesty as well. I think there's a lot of overlap between how that functions. Like it's another thing that people often try to use as an argument for moral relativism is that modesty standards differ between societies, and I've
Oh, I
I've never
see.
found that to be very convincing for the same reason I don't find the fact that manners vary between societies a convincing argument
Hmm.
against manners. Um,
I mean, I think in particular because you're taking a kind of, I guess you could say, individual based, agent based. What is it? What does it guide the person, and not saying that these necessarily come from society on high, although they do, right? They're shaped by that. Um, I think it tells you that again, these can be variable across societies, right? So, in the sense that Hadza hunter gatherers can't brag about the prey that they killed, right? The fact that there is a social norm around that and shows that uh, you're not going to be a defector to others around you by bragging.
yeah.
It's
Is
pretty
is that
significant
a
psychologically.
is
Yeah,
that a norm across a lot of hunter gatherer societies or
yeah, that's right. Yeah, generally, you're not supposed to brag about things that you've killed, even if it's a big kill, and others have an obligation basically to make snide comments about your kill, like, "Oh, it could have been more meat," or, "I've seen someone kill bigger ones before," or, maybe it's not your best. They're all playing the role where they say, "Okay, actually, this was probably pretty good."
Mhm.
But we have to make sure that we're all still playing the game where we're all not going to be better than others.
Yeah, so I feel like we've talked a lot. But that actually is an interesting crossover to the next thing I wanted to talk about, because we've talked a lot about the function of manners between strangers
Yeah,
so far. We've gone a little bit into intimates, but sort of more of like the signal of dropping manners.
yeah.
But the hunter gatherer case is an interesting case where it's like, okay, what is the function of manners among intimates? Because you could think about it like any given group of hunter gatherers, like, I don't know, what's you're the anthropologist, what's like the normal stable group size range?
I mean, like, 120 to 200 individuals at
Right. So
most.
you know everyone, and that's enough people to where you can know them pretty well, but you still need some form of manners. And I think that even goes down to much more intimate relationships. Like in the notes that I sent you, I was like, yeah, there's a line in a Heinlein novel where he's like, formal courtesy matters even more between husband and wife than it does between strangers.
Mm.
And it's like, that seems like an extreme thing to say, but it's sort of true. It's like, you don't owe your spouse the exact same formal courtesy that
Yeah,
you owe a stranger. However, if you had no courtesy in a marriage, you would constantly be devolving into
yeah.
fights.
It would be like a
Like,
nasty tit for tat game, right?
yeah, exactly. Like, you in fact see this in people who are like couples all the time, like that they can't let things go. They can't just, be a little formal, and it's like, if you don't ever separate yourself from what's happening, if you don't ever like get into that mode where you're just like paying attention and you're going to like do the formal thing and like treat the person openly with kindness, you're going to constantly find that anyone that you interact with every day is going to be highly abrasive.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Like, it doesn't matter how pleasant that person is, you're going to find ways that they rub you in the wrong way.
Yeah,
Um, and so I think like things like manners, and once again, they change in intimate relationships, but still like finding the ways in which your relationship can still enter into that attentive, slightly distanced mode whenever it needs to is very important.
hmm,
Like, once again, you're balancing these other things. Like, once in an intimate relationship, your duty to the truth increases. Um, your freedom to be quote unquote your authentic self,
hmm,
to like feel like you can show your bad side or express, some of your darker feelings or whatever. Like, that person that you're in an intimate relationship should be open
yeah,
to confronting some of those
yeah,
things,
yeah, yeah,
but that doesn't license you to do that to them all the time.
yeah,
And you don't get there's no intimate relationship in which you get a free pass to just wantonly go off the cuff whenever you're slightly, annoyed or anything like that.
right.
So this idea, though, that there's
Hmm.
tension between manners and other modes, like this does get to the back around to that, like what I said is the hard case, which is the potential tension between manners and truthfulness. Because I think this is the most common
Right. Yes.
conflict for manners. Um,
One thing I'd say is, with regards to the spouse example, is one thing we've brought up is the idea that manners are artificial, right? And maybe that's the case with strangers, but it's a more difficult balancing act with the people that you're very close with, right?
Yeah.
That's a different game. It's much harder to play, and it requires much more attention to self and the person that you're with in order to do it. It's really a ramped up version of the same thing that you're doing, with others around you in society.
Yeah. And there are cultures, though, in fact, probably more cultures than not, where there's still what we would think of as formal courtesy
Mm-hmm.
between husbands and wives or between friends
Sure.
as well. Like other societies have a lot more rules around those sorts of relationships than our society does.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing some of the conflicts that people regularly get in, like maybe that's a good technology for most people
Yeah.
is if they had more rules. Like maybe maybe the modal person needs more rules,
Yeah.
and the lack of rules is not working out for everyone. uh
I mean, I totally believe that to be the case, right? The fact that, like you said, you have to renegotiate
yeah.
in every instance with someone is extremely painful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's exhausting, and it is a funny thing about um the ways in which we have like these things that are public squares but also quasi private. Like, so all of social media is like this. Like it's a public square insofar as like your duties to truthfulness are probably more like those of like a formal public square, but it's also a place where people are mostly interacting with their friends
Mm-hmm.
and engaging in games with their friends. And so you're constantly having like people's rules and expectations just ramming up against each other, and people getting angry out of nowhere, getting confused.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know, I every single tweet that I've had that's gone viral in the past 8 months, I think has gone viral mostly from people who misunderstood what I was saying and were very, very angry about it because they didn't understand the joke, which was like written for like I would send these things out there like not expecting a bunch of people to read them because I was like, oh, like 12 of my friends will find this really, really funny, and then people did not read the irony
Yeah.
and
Right. Right.
angry. And so the example that the personal thing that I thought of about um the different, like your duty to Parisia versus
Mm.
your duty to manners is, so you have a case where someone believes something that is false.
Okay.
Not just that you think is like let's say it's like objectively false, but in a way that they're like using to anchor some sort of like moral proposition as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you're having an interaction with this person. They're like a relative stranger, like, right, they're wearing a Mets cap and you're a fan of the Mets, so you like start talking about the Mets with them, and then like just comes up, they're like, oh yeah, I believe this completely insane thing,
Yeah.
and I think in that situation you're you don't really have that high of a duty to Parhesia. Like your duty at most sort of caps up at like, I don't think that's true, but whatever.
Yeah.
Or you know, are you sure about that, or something like that. Like that isn't an invitation to like enter into the like let's start arguing about
Yeah.
first
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like, what the facts are, things like that. Um,
It's a good point.
but with strangers, there are like modes that people enter into where they're 100% asking for that,
Mm-hmm.
and you're supposed to return it to them. And this doesn't happen a lot. And I can only really think of one big example where this has ever happened to me in my life, which was um, when I was in law school. Uh, my wife and I are at the mall in Durham, and this street evangelist walks up to me. And I'm like being relatively polite and, just like letting him go through his spiel. And then he's like, and this is like, this is Western Holy Week that
Okay.
year.
Yeah.
Um, so it was a year the Orthodox calendar was quite a ways off. So I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks before uh, my Holy Week that year. Anyways, and the guy goes, well, and this is also like, I know this is like people celebrate Easter this week, but you know that Easter was created by Constantine, Council of Nicaea. And before that, everyone just celebrated Passover. And this is like just objectively
That's
wrong
just false. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in many different ways. Like he's confused in multiple ways. And I just like, hold up. Let's talk.
Yeah.
And I think I ended up talking to this guy for 20 minutes. It's like I was like going through all the things. So it's like, okay, so once like Easter is only really what we call it in English. Almost every other language calls it some derivative of the Hebrew for Passover. Like I'm going through is like the Acts of the Council of Nicaea, like considered by almost everyone to be authentic. You can go read them on the internet right now. I'll pull them up for you. Show you that this is not what anything that they were being discussed. And it was funny because people started seeing that I'm having this debate with this street evangelist.
Hmm.
So people start, birding us. And, um, this keeps on going. Like, my wife is like, bless her, she's like pretty good humored about me, like, wasting our
Stopping and
time
doing this. Yeah,
shopping
yeah.
and like arguing with this street evangelist for 20 straight minutes. And like I thought about it as like I was like, all right, there's like very little chance that I convince this guy
Yeah.
of anything. But I am like spending like whatever amount of his time that he is not spending going and like telling some poor sap who doesn't have any idea that he's just spouting nonsense.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's also the chance that I knew that once again, if you talk to these people, like people will stop and watch you. Like I've had this happen with other street evangelists, but like never to this extent before. There's some chance that someone watching you overhears what's going on, learns something, comes away with it, like knowing something that they wouldn't have known otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a different kind of game than,
Yeah,
running into the guy at the sports bar, right? Like, the reason that
right.
person at the sports bar shared that information was to, like, find something in common with you. And it's
Yeah,
rude then to be like, oh, this facet of your identity is BS, and
yeah,
I'm going to, like, destroy you for it. On the other hand, this person is, like, engaged in, like, an explicitly epistemic enterprise.
yeah,
And so it would be kind of rude for you to not, well, I'm not going to make that normative, but in some ways, there is something a different kind of duty in that situation.
yeah. Yeah, it's one thing to like if Mormon missionaries like come up to your doors, like start going, yeah, let's talk about the Book of Abraham, and then it's another thing if you just like meet someone and they mention that they're
Yeah.
LDS, and you're like, well, yeah, let's talk about
Oh,
the Book of
by the
Abraham,
way,
buddy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And once again, I think like your duties in the public sphere very very different. Like it would not be a violation of norms for me to go on Twitter and say, yeah, the Book of Abraham was, quote unquote, translated from funerary papyruses, and Joseph Smith just obviously made it all
yeah,
up.
yeah.
And that would be fine, but it would be a violation of manners for me to just like walk up to someone who I knew was Mormon and just start doing that. And like this comes up a lot of times in the religious context when people are talking about free speech laws. Like comes like I mean, just today there was a UK MP who was like, freedom of speech just means like freedom to insult Muslims, and it's like, well, I mean, no. And the other thing is like people should
Yeah,
be
right.
allowed to say critiques, give their critiques of religion. And just because it would be rude to like walk into a mosque and like start
Yeah,
lighting a Quran on fire, or it would be rude to like, you know, confront your kebab guy and like start wanting to
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
argue
yeah.
about
Yeah,
hadith.
I mean that's a different situation,
Yeah,
right? Than if you and I are engaged in some conversation about the matter.
yeah. But if you, yeah, if, and it's like, but people commonly, I think, want to confuse these modes because they actually have a very difficult time separating them, or I think want to confuse these modes to like get things out of the public square,
Right.
that they want to get out of the public square.
Right.
um, and I think like that's what's really important is like, yeah, so these values are in tension sometimes, but that's actually what, to me, that's actually what moral and ethical action is about, is knowing how to resolve tensions. um, and I think it's like, this is why I don't believe in a strongly rules based ethical system.
Yeah.
Is I do think this is actually the essence of moral action, is knowing how to exercise the wisdom to figure out on what side you have to be on when values are in
In a given
contention.
situation. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like
No,
that's what morality is. It's not following rules. It's these other things. And that's just another reason why I think the manners game is important, is it actually like it's a very strong signal of like you knowing how to rules balance, is knowing when to be mannered, when not to be, so on.
yeah, I mean it's in many ways it's trained virtue. I mean this is why you get it.
Yeah.
I think among aristocratic classes and so on. It's not something that they are like immediately or genetically endowed with, right?
Yeah.
But it is something that's taught and cultivated. Uh, which, yeah, I mean, contrast that with this idea of speaking frankly, which is, uh, it's almost like Kantian in its dogmatism. Um,
But I mean, it's also classically considered an aristocratic virtue.
yeah,
Like this is actually, I mean, like to me, this is actually one reason why free speech is important,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
is because it was classically considered something that just belonged to aristocrats.
yeah.
The good American Democrat in me is like, how dare you tell me that I am not allowed to exercise this? You know, what are you saying? I'm a peasant? No, this is America. We are all aristocrats.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But again, it's a virtue, right? It's something
Yeah.
that's trained, not.
Yeah. It's like you can't exercise it willy nilly, but you know, that once again is like, I think the government cannot tell you to not exercise a
Yeah.
virtue. Is
Yeah.
sort of like where I come down on this.
Oh, interesting. Right.
Is that it actually closes off a virtuous technology,
That's fascinating.
is
Yeah.
to excessively legislate speech. And like once again, I think that there is room to some degree to legislate manners. Like it is a funny thing. Like I'm not saying, like, once again, I don't think that that would be correct in American society. I think it would violate the Constitution. It's not
Yeah.
something that I think is inherently wrong. If there's
I see
a
what you mean.
what, yeah, and I think the same thing. There's this letter of John Adams's that I think about a lot, where I can't remember who he's writing to in this letter, and he's like, I hope that, like, he basically says like, I hope that our people will have like the virtue to enact sumptuary laws.
Wow.
And it's like he just just naturally saw this as part of Republican virtue, that we
Yeah.
wouldn't let people wear too fancy of clothes.
Wow.
Um, and like, yeah, like actually sumptuary laws make some sense. And you don't have to like go very far outside your door to see people who enter into conflict over what clothes people are
Her dress.
wearing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. and just go, oh, well, maybe it would be a good thing in some societies for people not to enter into this like war of all against all by like signaling through like what clothes you're wearing and
Right.
trying to trying to gain trying to turn fashion into this infinite status hamster wheel. So like, but like I said, like you can legislate to get people to exercise more virtue. So you can legitimately legislate in some societies, like, okay, you can't insult someone's religion in a place where you should be engaging in the mannered game.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can imagine legislation or like a jury system in which people are actually able to adjudicate that properly. Um, but the way that we write legislation in modern Western societies, like we don't really have the technology to distinguish between what you do in the mannered game and what you do in the public square, where you have like this greater duty to truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing on the books saying that you can't eat bacon outside a mosque and burn the Quran and draw
Yeah,
Muhammad or something like. But you shouldn't do that. Like,
yeah,
and that's really hard to come up with precise legislation for those kinds of edge cases. Yeah.
and yeah, the drawing Muhammad thing is actually a really interesting case
Mm-hmm.
where when the when like the Charlie Hebdo thing happened in France, there is this weird thing where it's like, okay, I would not have done what they did that drew on that attack.
Yeah.
But once that happens, is there then actually a moral obligation of other people in the journalism sphere to also then start drawing Muhammad?
Right.
Like that's actually like
That's interesting.
a funny question where it's like, okay, so now that someone's shown that they're willing
That you
to
can't do this.
kill,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, is there then like then do you is that duty to like not gratuitously insult this community that lives in your country overpowered by this duty to say, oh, we're not going to be cowed
Yeah.
by
Yeah. Yeah.
an
Right.
intolerant minority
Right.
of this community? Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point.
And you can also imagine too, like there are societies where like you do have to legislate away some parrhesia
Mm-hmm.
in order to just protect the society um, from melting down. Um, and once again, I like don't think you can legitimately do that in the United States without changing the Constitution. But I'm not going to tell, um, you know, I'm not going to tell like the Singaporeans that they can't have the various rules that they have around,
Yeah. Around norms.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, around religion. They seem to genuinely believe those are necessary to keep a multi-confessional society from collapsing into disorder. And it's not my state, and that very well might be true.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
um, but I would say, like, once again, if you're legislating away the ways that people can exercise virtue, I think you would have to be exceedingly careful about doing so. There would have to be a very high burden to do that for me. Um, so we've kind of diverged quite a bit from the question of manners, gone more into sort of like general exercise of virtue, like
Mm-hmm.
where we can draw lines around legislation. And I think this is like a good conversation to have, but possibly we should maybe look for a book or an essay
Yeah.
that we
Yeah.
could do
Yeah.
something to anchor a discussion around this at some future point.
I think that's a good idea.
Do you have anything else to say about the subject of manners before we wrap up?
Not really. I mean, I really appreciate this view of it as a cultural technology of sorts. And the idea that it's not something that you are only playing for the sake of the other person. You're playing it for the sake of yourself in two ways, right? One is to protect yourself in a system where there are roles. You can't be offended if you were being mannered and the person was mad at you. You did everything right, and they were attacking you for some other reason. The other reason is this ability of manners to scaffold attention, which I think is very valuable in relations with other people. It helps the person around you, but it also helps yourself um, for sort of walking through more difficult things in life.
So yeah. So yeah, just to sum up, manners are a virtue. You need to be saying sir and ma'am more. You need to be sir maxing out there, and your life will just be easier, and you'll somehow discover that you were a better person for it all along. So anyhow, thanks, Cody. Hopefully, we'll be on again in a couple of weeks discussing something new. And for everyone who's listening, if you're on YouTube, please like, subscribe. Listening anywhere other than Substack, please subscribe to the Substack. It's free, but I'll probably post some text updates there from time to time. So it's just another way to keep track of things. And thanks for listening.